Yemen's Houthi rebels have global shipping by the throat, and if recent US and UK response is anything to go by, we may see trade go blue in the face before these militants loosen their grip on the Red Sea. At least that's one perspective, one that happens to be espoused by the Chinese state-run tabloid newspaper, the Global Times. According to the Times, speaking of the latest spate of January counterstrikes on Houthi assets, the missions failed to stop Houthis from attacking shipping, and now Houthis are targeting US ships. A Houthi anti-ship ballistic missile struck a US-owned and operated cargo ship on Monday. What's the point of that escalation? The retaliation and counter-retaliation are snowballing in the Red Sea. It is now evident that the US and the UK have underestimated the military capabilities of the Houthi militants. Harsh words, but seeing as the strikes authorized by US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak have done little to curb Houthi aggression in this vital area for global trade, it's hard to disagree outright. Since December of 2023, in conjunction with increased Israeli aggression against Hamas and civilians in Gaza, Houthi militants backed by the interests of Iran have been attacking trading vessels passing through the Red Sea, described by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning as an important artery for global trade in goods and energy. On December 3rd, attacks were launched against 3 different shipping vessels connected to 14 different countries. The Houthis claim that their targets are Israeli-linked vessels, but their attacks have been far less specific than their messaging. Things have only escalated from there, resulting in an untenable situation for the global markets. The importance of this particular embattled area to the world economy cannot be overstated. Linking the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean Sea via the Suez Canal as the fastest shipping route from Asia to Europe, the Red Sea plays host to nearly 15% of global shipping traffic. Yeah, 15%. If you have trouble quantifying that in real terms, in 2023, 123.5 million metric tons of goods were transported via the adjoining Suez Canal. Just kidding, those numbers are actually just the figures for January of 2023. 2022 saw a grand total of around 22,000 ships pass through the Suez Canal. It's responsible for 12% of global trade by volume, and that's not just shipping, it's trade overall. Cast your mind back to 2021 and you may remember the chaos caused by the ever-given obstruction of the Suez Canal, an incident that lasted for only 6 days and 7 hours, compared to the weeks of protracted disruptive attacks being committed by the Houthis here. And the global economy may need to brace for impact, as there are no clear-cut answers for when this may come to an end. In the words of a former merchant mariner and shipping historian, Sal Mercoliano, this is a choke point on the most densely used trade route on the planet. Any disruption is going to impact the entire supply chain. If we're to think of global trade as a human body, then these 2 trade routes are, to paraphrase Mao, the veins and arteries, and the Houthis, despite their relatively small size in the grand scheme of things, are giving the body of global trade an embolism. The Houthi attacks along the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, also known as the Gate of Tears, connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and bordered by Yemen, Djibouti, and Eritrea, have had catastrophic effects on shipping in the Suez. Between December 18, 2023 and January 7, 2024, a period of only 3 weeks, fleet capacity moving through the Suez dropped a staggering 60% compared to the same time last year. In order to avoid the wrath of Houthi militants, most vessels are opting to take an alternate route around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, adding 10 to 14 days and 3,500 nautical miles to what should have been a relatively painless voyage. This not only results in delays for both companies and consumers eagerly waiting for goods to arrive, but it also drives up devastating fuel and insurance premium costs for both the distributors of the goods and the shipping companies themselves. Let's look at some specifics on how these increases in shipping rates are playing out. According to Xeneta, a prominent shipping rate analysis organization, freight shipping rates between the Far East and Northern Europe have increased by 124% since the Red Sea crisis escalated in mid-December. From the Far East to the Mediterranean, we've seen a cost increase of 118%, and to the US East Coast, 45%. The longer the crisis continues, the more we're going to see these percentages climb to truly terrifying levels. And if all this wasn't bad enough, by pure cruel coincidence, the Panama Canal, one of the other most valuable shipping routes on Earth, has been struck by droughts that bottleneck shipping there too. It's a terrible time to be in freight. Experts from the International Institute for Strategic Studies are calling it the greatest maritime threat since the wave of Somali pirate attacks in the 2010s. Nick Childs, one of the IISS's senior fellows for naval forces and maritime security, claimed that it's inevitable that economies will have to absorb the costs of maritime insecurity. The stranglehold on goods is one thing, but the fuel that this could add to the fire of a potential energy crisis is a whole different ballgame. In December of 2023, amidst the first Houthi conflict escalation in the Red Sea, BP suspended shipping of oil and natural gas through the Suez to take the Cape of Good Hope route instead. This saw a rise in oil prices, particularly dangerous in the winter months of the Western world, as Brent crude, a European market benchmark for global oil prices, saw a rise of 2.6% to $78.56 a barrel. And let's not forget that this is a Middle Eastern conflict we're talking about here, where endless national and militant interests are hopelessly enmeshed in a complex web that's impossible to even approach without sending a ripple effect across the region. The Houthis have called for an Israeli ceasefire as the primary condition for the cessation of their own attacks in the Red Sea, while U.S. Central Command has confirmed that Iran is directly shipping weapons to the Houthis in order to fuel ongoing proxy conflicts. CENTCOM General Michael Eric Kurilla said in press release, "It's clear that Iran continues shipping of advanced lethal aid to the Houthis. This is yet another example of how Iran actively sows instability throughout the region in direct violation of UN Security Resolution 2216 and international law." Naturally, this has the Saudis concerned about their stake, given their long-standing conflicts with the Houthis and Iran, while Egypt has been receiving collateral damage as a result of the conflict escalating, especially in a financial sense. Egypt, which is a country that's already struggling economically, relies on the Suez Canal transit fees for $9 billion every year, so they're already feeling the sting of its compromised state. China's called for ceasefires across the board, though naturally it suits their agenda to see the United States, their biggest geopolitical rival on the world stage, lose leverage to Iran on the Middle Eastern regional theater. That being said, China has split its interests on this. Given they're a global exports juggernaut, disruptions to trade will always be unideal for Beijing. With factories preparing to shut down for Lunar New Year events in China, shipping in this area will be feeling the pinch even worse. But before we go deeper into the specifics of the current situation in the Red Sea, and the disastrous consequences that a botched U.S. response will have on the entire global economy, we need to ask the question that you might be afraid to ask. Who exactly are the Houthis, and why do they have a stake in the Israel-Gaza conflict? Also known as Ansar Allah, meaning supporters of God, the Houthis are an armed militant and religious group from Yemen claiming to represent the country's Shia Muslim minority known as the Zaydis. First rising up in the early 1990s, they took their name from their founder, Hussein al-Houthi. The Houthis have remained a family business, as after the death of Hussein al-Houthi, his brother, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, took the reins. The Houthis wouldn't start grabbing headlines until the early 2000s, when they fought in a number of rebellions against Yemen's authoritarian leader, President Ali Abdullah Saleh, hoping to gain greater freedoms for their people in the north of Yemen. Saleh lost his seat during the Arab Spring in 2011, at which point he actually allied with the Houthis, allowing them to take control of Sana'a, Yemen's capital, as well as large parts of western Yemen. In 2014, as a result of the sweeping gains of the Houthis across the country, their powerful U.S.-allied Sunni neighbor, Saudi Arabia, started to get concerned at the prospect of a Houthi-controlled Yemen, which they suspected would quickly become a proxy of one of their most powerful Middle Eastern rivals, Iran. That's why Saudi Arabia became a powerful sponsor of the internationally recognized Presidential Leadership Council, fighting against the Houthis' Supreme Political Council. Indeed sponsored by Iran in the extraordinarily brutal Yemeni civil war, which has killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions from their homes. The UN brokered ceasefire in 2022, and in 2023 a lot of the fighting seemed to actually die down, as whispers of genuine peace talks between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia grew, which analysts fear might be compromised by the ripple effects of the Israel-Gaza conflict. If you're curious about where exactly the Houthis stand on the major players in this issue, their official slogan is "God is great, death to the US, death to Israel, curse the Jews, and victory for Islam." Which brings us back to the Red Sea attacks. Given that the Houthis have been occupied by the Yemeni civil war for so long, the Israel-Gaza conflict gave them the perfect opportunity to step out onto the world stage. One particularly striking incident with this whole affair was the capture of the Japanese-operated Galaxy Leader ship and its 25-member internationally sourced crew on November 19, 2023. A helicopter manned by armed Houthis descended upon the ship, holding the crew at gunpoint and docking the ship off the coast of Yemen. Because the firm that owned the ship was in turn co-owned by an Israeli businessman, the Houthis took the Galaxy leader's crew hostage as part of its leverage in Israeli-Palestinian military negotiations, giving them only minimum contact with the outside world. The UN shipping agency called for an unconditional release of the ship's crew, and it triggered 11 nations on the UN Security Council to officially demand a cessation of the Red Sea attacks. However, it's interesting to note that 4 nations, Algeria, China, Mozambique, and Russia, abstained from voting entirely. All this leads you to wonder what exactly can be done about the situation short of strong-arming Israel into ending its aggression against Gaza. The US and its allies have been working on solutions to the ongoing crisis. In late December, Pentagon Press Secretary Major General Pat Ryder announced the military task force under the title Operation Prosperity Guardian, operating under the objective of being a kind of highway patrol for the Red Sea, a defensive coalition in the region protecting their economic interests from the seemingly constant instability in the Middle East following the start of the new conflicts in Gaza. Ryder said of the Houthis, "They really need to ask themselves if they've bitten off more than they can chew when it comes to taking on the entire international community and negatively impacting billions and billions of dollars in global trade, economic prosperity, and international law." These words have a certain ironic ring to them, knowing how Operation Prosperity Guardian's bluster surrounding the Red Sea crisis has resulted in relatively meager actual results so far. On January 10th, Houthi forces launched an attack on a US allied warship using over 20 missiles and drones, marking a sharp increase in tensions between the Houthis and the Prosperity Guardians. On January 11th and 12th, the coalition behind Prosperity Guardian performed a series of airstrikes on Houthi targets as a result of the January 10th attack, and also because of the Houthis' failure to respond to orders of a ceasefire and a formal letter sent by the UK to the Houthi leaders on behalf of the international community. President Biden characterized the attacks as a clear message sent to the Houthis that the United States will not tolerate threats to freedom of navigation, and Prime Minister Sunak called the strikes a limited and proportionate act of self-defense. International support for these potentially escalating strikes has been less than enthusiastic, with some critics describing them as really more of a symbolic gesture than a genuinely effective military strategy. This is where it seems as though the Chinese sources may have a point. The United States has consistently underestimated the capabilities of the Houthis, who are a battle-hardened collective whose weapons have seen considerable advancement thanks to Iranian funding. The Houthis have been enduring Saudi airstrikes during the Yemeni civil war for a decade, making these attacks seem paltry by comparison. The response to Biden's, quote, clear message and Sunak's self-defense was swift and decisive. On January 14th, the Houthis brazenly attacked a U.S. Navy destroyer stationed in the Red Sea. Then they launched another attack on a U.S.-owned ship the day after, indicating that if Operation Prosperity Guardian has had any effect on the Houthi militants, those effects certainly have not been striking fear into their hearts. The Houthis have seen a popularity boost in their native Yemen for their operations against Israel and U.S. forces in the Red Sea, and the second that one of those attacks causes a casualty among British or American forces, a stronger retaliation will likely be on its way to western Yemen. It's what Yemen researcher Nicholas Brumfield refers to as an escalation loop, a scenario that means trouble for U.S. President Joe Biden, who has publicly committed to straightening out the shipping issues without causing further instability in the region, a promise that the United States, from anyone's perspective, has a pretty lousy record of keeping. Another Yemen researcher, Hannah Porter, has been quoted saying, "If the US and the UK respond to the continued Houthi escalation with more airstrikes on Yemen, then this will impact regional security, including in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Although these countries do not want to return to military engagement with the Houthis, ongoing escalation could change that calculus. The Houthis have been waging a lithe and agile war of attrition, with relatively cheap drones and missiles, many of which, as we've already established, have been coming from their silent partners in Iran. They've been wreaking billions of dollars in damage to the economies of their enemies." According to Porter, the actions of the US and UK under Operation Prosperity Guardian have been terribly misguided. While the US claims to have chipped away at the Houthis' abilities to target ships by destroying anti-ship ballistic missile launchers, Porter has posited that US intervention will lead to the Houthis intensifying their attacks, not stepping them down, and she's far from alone in this belief. Israel and the United States are the greatest rhetorical enemies of the Houthis, and given that the only casualties of these engagements at the time of this video's production have been Houthi casualties, the whole thing has acted as a wonderful recruitment propaganda for the Houthi cause. They've been packing rallies in Yemen since the beginning of the late 2023 spike in Israeli hostility, and based on the current tactics of the Western coalition under Prosperity Guardian, their momentum is only going to increase, which is terrible news for anyone with a vested interest in the safe passage of goods and energy through the Suez, which is to say, basically everyone. However, it would be oversimplifying the situation to say that the United States' only response to the Red Sea crisis has been military bluster. In fact, another major angle of indirect attack manifested on January 17th, when the United States government announced that it would be redesignating the Houthis as a global terrorist organization, with a 30-day timer before their designation and its consequences would come into effect, giving the Houthis time to rethink their decisions and de-escalate their Red Sea attacks. To succinctly sum up what this new designation would mean in material terms, Kimberly Halkett of Al Jazeera stated, "It will trigger sanctions for anyone or any state or entity that now tries to provide material support for the Houthis. We know that they are an Iranian-backed group, so Iran, for example, could now be subject to more sanctions. It means that members of the Houthi group would be banned from entering the United States, and any Houthi funds that are in U.S. financial institutions would be frozen." Blinken also said of the decision, "The designation seeks to promote accountability for the group's terrorist activities. If the Houthis cease their attacks in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, the United States will reevaluate this designation." It's intended to strike at the heart of the issue, Iran, the real power behind the Houthi attacks. But as with basically any plan, the United States has to deal with instability in the Middle East. There are some pretty serious strings attached which have given a lot of political analysts pause. Keen foreign policy enthusiasts will already have noticed that this isn't the first time that the Houthis have received a designation like this from the US government. The Trump administration declared the Houthis a, quote, foreign terrorist organization during their term, which drew ire from the humanitarian groups who believed the sanctions would do little to lessen Houthi aggression and would in fact pass the costs on to the suffering people of Yemen, still rocked by the consequences of the brutal civil war we were discussing earlier. The designation was repealed by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in February 2021 under the Biden administration in a move that was intended to get the humanitarian aid flowing back into Yemen again. Blinken and others claim that in this case the associated sanctions are being designed not to cause collateral harm to innocent citizens of Yemen, but sanctions are often a rather blunt tool, and if these sanctions do indeed just end up forcing the Yemenis into further suffering, there's almost no way that this won't result in more Houthi conscripts. Houthi spokesperson Mohammed Abdul Salam has also outright said that the designation of their group as terrorists will not prevent them from staging attacks on ships in the Red Sea and continuing to support the people of Palestine. And as for Iran, receiving a bevy of US sanctions is just another Tuesday for them. Whether the sanctions associated with this designation will have any meaningful impact on their behavior will come down to a simple cost-benefit analysis. Is the leverage they're gaining over the US, the Middle East, and the global economy greater than what they stand to lose via sanctions? When we put it in these terms, it doesn't give much hope for the situation in the Red Sea to improve overnight. The actions of the Houthis in the Red Sea have also seen support from Lebanon's Hezbollah. Hassan Nasrallah, the group's leader, has reaffirmed the Houthi position that the only way to bring peace to the Red Sea is to also bring peace to Gaza. He called on the coalition behind Operation Prosperity Guardian to treat the cause rather than just remedy the symptoms. And given that the Biden administration has been openly funding the Israeli military and thus continuing the war in Gaza, it's hard to argue that the US doesn't bear some responsibility on this front. Though incidentally, much like the Houthis, Hezbollah receives considerable funding from Iran and is part of the so-called Middle Eastern Axis of Resistance. When looked at from a distance, it's clear that Iran's long game has been paying off masterfully, as they now have greater economic influence on the world stage than they ever had before, all through the use of well-placed proxies. We've even been seeing certain kinds of military innovation from the Houthis' assault on the Red Sea ships. Some analysts have even pointed out that the Houthis may have been the first of any military to use specialized anti-ship ballistic missiles, which travel at significantly higher speeds and altitudes than conventional cruise missiles. Simply put, the Houthis have the members of Operation Prosperity Guardian in check. If they choose to escalate their attacks on the Houthis, it's only more likely to radicalize more Yemeni citizens, while draining the military resources of their enemies. If they do nothing, the Houthis will continue their Red Sea attack campaigns that squeeze the global economy tighter and tighter. It's clear that the United States underestimated the Houthi rebels, as it often has a nasty habit of doing with its enemies in cases of asymmetric warfare. Just ask the Taliban currently ruling Afghanistan, or the Viet Cong just after the disastrous Vietnam War. For the sake of all involved, we can only hope that a ceasefire in Gaza prevails and the arteries of trade become once again unblocked. But what do you think? Is there such a thing as a silver bullet answer to this crisis in the Red Sea, or is seeking overall peace the only way? Join the conversation down in the comments. Now go ahead and check out this video, or maybe this one instead.